No one noticed the cafeteria change at first.
Mhm.
Not because it happened overnight, but because it didn't. The portions became slightly smaller, the meat a little tougher, the vegetables less fresh. Nothing bad enough to complain about, nothing obvious enough to report. People shrugged it off. They joked about it in line. They stopped finishing their plates. Some started bringing lunch from home. Others grabbed fast food instead. And slowly, everyone accepted it. The company records showed nothing wrong. Same budget, same benefits, same productivity on paper. That's how toxic systems often begin, not with a crisis, but with people lowering their expectations one meal at a time. So let me ask you something. What is lunch like at your workplace? Is it something you look forward to, or something you quietly endure? Tell me in the comments. And stay with me. Because this is the story of what happened when one employee stopped accepting good enough and found a way to make the people in power experience the truth themselves. This is the story of Emily and what really happened in her company cafeteria. The cafeteria did not fall apart overnight. There was no moment when someone walked in, took one bite, and pushed the tray away in disgust. No dramatic complaints, no emails sent in all caps, no emergency meetings. The change came quietly, spread thin across weeks, then months, until it was difficult to say exactly when things had started to feel wrong. At first, it was the portions. The plates looked the same. The trays were the same muted gray plastic. The menu boards still displayed familiar names: grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, rice pilaf, pasta with sauce. But the chicken pieces were smaller now, thinner, trimmed close to the bone. A serving that once felt adequate now felt cautious, as if the kitchen had learned how to shave off just enough to save money without attracting attention. Then it was the texture. The chicken grew tougher, requiring more chewing. It wasn't inedible, just resistant. The kind of meat that made people slow down, not because they were savoring it, but because their jaw needed the extra time. Protein still existed on the plate, technically, but it no longer carried the weight it once had. The vegetables followed. Broccoli that used to snap now bent. Spinach that once wilted softly under heat now collapsed into itself, dark and watery. Nothing was rotten. Nothing violated any obvious safety rule. The food still looked acceptable under fluorescent lighting. It passed the eye test easily. It just didn't taste good anymore. People noticed, but they noticed the way people notice the weather. Something to be endured, not confronted. Comments were made while standing in line. Quiet remarks exchanged between coworkers staring at the sneeze guard. Did this used to be better? Or am I imagining it? I swear the chicken used to be bigger. Same menu, different results. The tone was casual, mildly annoyed, almost amused. In the break room, during short pauses between meetings, people mentioned it again. Someone joked about needing a second lunch. Someone else said they'd started bringing snacks from home. The conversation never lingered long enough to become serious. No one opened a ticket. No one filled out a form. No one escalated anything. The cafeteria was still, technically, a benefit. Around that time, an internal announcement went out, a short message buried between updates about software patches and a reminder to complete compliance training. Same budget, updated vendor, no change to benefits. That was it, no explanation, no justification, just reassurance. The words did what they were meant to do. They framed the change as neutral, managed, intentional, something already accounted for. Emily Carter read the message once, then again. She worked as a data analyst, mid-level, no direct reports, no authority beyond the numbers she handled. She wasn't responsible for facilities, procurement, or employee experience. None of this fell under her job description. Still, the phrasing bothered her. Same budget meant someone had decided the numbers still worked. Updated vendor meant a choice had been made. No change to benefits suggested the company had already categorized the cafeteria as something that could not, by definition, get worse. Emily didn't respond to the email. Neither did anyone else she knew. But she started noticing patterns. More people skipped lunch entirely. They stayed at their desks, sipping coffee longer than they should. Others left the building, returning with takeout bags and plastic containers that smelled better than anything coming from downstairs. By early afternoon, energy dipped across the floor. Meetings ran slower. Cameras stayed off longer during video calls. People rubbed their eyes, leaned back in their chairs, reached for vending machine snacks that hadn't changed in years. Emily tracked numbers for a living. She couldn't help but connect things. It wasn't dramatic. Productivity didn't collapse. No deadlines were. No, missed because of lunch alone. But the edge was gone. The sharpness that came after a good meal, when people returned to their desks feeling reset, had faded. Instead, there was a kind of dull persistence. Work still got done, just not as cleanly, not as energetically. Emily mentioned it once, casually, to a colleague while waiting for coffee. "Do you feel more tired lately?" she asked. The colleague shrugged. "I thought it was just me." That was the answer she kept hearing. Everyone assumed the problem was individual. Personal, sleep schedules, stress, age, anything but the environment they all shared. The cafeteria became something people planned around instead of forward to. Some brought lunch from home. Others accepted the downgrade and adjusted their expectations. A few complained quietly and then stopped mentioning it altogether. What struck Emily wasn't the decline itself. It was how quickly everyone adapted. No one demanded better food. They just ate less. No one challenged the change. They changed themselves instead. The standards shifted downward, one small compromise at a time, until the new normal felt oddly permanent. From a distance, everything looked fine. Meals were still served. Employees were still working. Benefits were still listed on the website. There was no crisis to point to. No single moment that justified alarm. And that, Emily realized, was the problem. Toxic environments rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive as disasters. They arrive as adjustments, small enough to tolerate, reasonable enough to explain away. A little less food, a little less energy, a little less expectation. By the time anyone notices what's missing, they've already learned how to live without it. Emily sat at her desk one afternoon, half a plate of lunch untouched beside her keyboard. She hadn't meant to stop eating. She just hadn't felt like continuing. Around her, the office hummed softly. Keyboards clicked. Notifications chimed. Work continued. Everything was functioning. And yet, something essential had quietly been taken away, not violently, not illegally, but so gradually that no one could say exactly when they'd agreed to lose it. Not because they chose to, but because they never thought the loss was worth fighting over. Emily did not write the email right away. She waited, Not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to be certain that what she was noticing wasn't just a personal irritation disguised as concern. She paid attention for another week, then another. She watched people carry lunches from home. She watched the line at the cafeteria shorten. She noticed how often half-eaten trays ended up in the trash. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no single incident she could point to. That was precisely why she decided to write. When Emily finally opened a new email draft, she was careful with every word. She did not mention frustration. She did not describe taste or texture. She avoided adjectives that could be dismissed as subjective. She wrote like an analyst. She asked whether the company had nutritional standards for employee meals. She asked how vendors were evaluated. She asked whether there were benchmarks for protein content, ingredient quality, or portion consistency. The email was polite, neutral, professional. She read it twice before sending, then once more, removing a sentence that sounded too personal. When she was done, the message contained no accusations, no demands, just questions. She addressed it to Human Resources. Then she closed her laptop and went back to work. The response arrived 2 days later. It was brief. It thanked her for reaching out. It acknowledged her interest in employee well-being. It assured her that the company took all feedback seriously. Then came the conclusions. Employee satisfaction, according to recent surveys, remained within an acceptable range. No violations of company policy or nutritional guidelines had been identified. No further action was required at this time. Emily stared at the email longer than she had expected to. She wasn't surprised. She had anticipated something like this, a templated response, efficient and complete, in the way only standardized language could be. Still, seeing it written so cleanly made the issue feel smaller than it was, contained, categorized, resolved. She considered replying. She could ask follow-up questions. She could request to see the data behind the satisfaction numbers. She could clarify that her concern wasn't about policy violations, but about gradual decline. But she didn't. Not yet. A few days later, she received a calendar invitation. It wasn't from HR. It was from Mark Reynolds, the head of facilities and operations. The meeting was short, 15 minutes. No agenda listed. Emily walked into the small conference room with her notebook closed, unsure whether she would need it. Mark was already there, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, smiled briefly, and gestured for her to sit. He didn't waste time. He explained that her email had been forwarded to his department. Not as a complaint exactly, but as a point of awareness. He assured her that facilities had reviewed the situation and found everything to be in order. The vendor met contractual obligations. Costs were controlled. There were no compliance issues. The cafeteria, he said, was not part of the company's core business. He didn't sound annoyed. He sounded practiced. Mark explained that changes like vendor updates happened all the time, that not every adjustment felt good to every employee. That part of scaling a business involved making trade-offs that weren't always visible from the outside. He advised her, gently, to be careful about where she invested her energy. This wasn't a warning. It didn't need to be. The message was clear enough. Emily nodded. She thanked him for his time. She said she understood, and she meant it, at least partially. What she understood now was not that she had been wrong, but that she had stepped into a space where concerns were measured not by their impact, but by their relevance to profit and productivity. Food was a benefit. Benefits were costs. Costs were numbers. Numbers, if they stayed within acceptable ranges, did not require attention. After the meeting, Emily returned to her desk and opened her inbox. Nothing had changed. No follow-up from HR, no additional questions, no invitation to continue the conversation. The system had done what it was designed to do. It had absorbed the feedback and neutralized it. Weeks later, during her performance review, the echo of that email surfaced again. The review itself was mostly positive. Emily met expectations. She was reliable. Her work was accurate. She collaborated well with her team. Then there was a line near the bottom. Occasionally overly focused on non-core issues. It wasn't framed as a problem. There were no consequences attached to it, no mention of disciplinary action. But it was there, written calmly in the same font as everything else. Emily read it twice. She understood what it meant. She hadn't been punished. She hadn't been silenced. She hadn't been told to stop speaking. She had simply been labeled. The label didn't block her path forward. It just narrowed it slightly. Enough to be felt, not enough to be challenged. That was the elegance of it. The company didn't discourage feedback outright. It allowed it, filtered, categorized, and assessed for risk. Feedback that aligned with existing priorities was welcomed. Feedback that questioned those priorities was noted, then redirected. Emily left the review meeting with the same polite smile she had entered with. Around her, nothing changed. The cafeteria continued serving the same meals. People continued adjusting. Conversations about lunch grew shorter, less frequent. The topic lost its novelty and then its urgency. Emily realized something unsettling. The system did not need people to stop caring. It only needed them to learn that caring came with a cost. Once that lesson was absorbed, most people made the rational choice. They focused on what was safe, what was rewarded, what moved their careers forward. Emily wasn't angry. She felt something colder than anger. Clarity. She understood now that the issue wasn't whether she was allowed to speak. She was. The issue was that the structure around her made speaking inefficient, isolating, and quietly disadvantageous. No one had told her she was wrong. They had simply made it unproductive for her to be right. And that, Emily realized as she closed her laptop at the end of the day, was how problems survived inside well-functioning systems. Not through denial, not through force, but through polite acknowledgement and careful dismissal. After Emily's email, nothing happened. At least, nothing visible. The cafeteria continued operating on schedule. The same trays slid across the same counters. The same menus rotated on the same days. On the surface, the system absorbed the disturbance and returned to equilibrium. But beneath that surface, something subtle shifted. People noticed. Not the food. Everyone had already noticed that. They noticed the reaction, or rather, the lack of one. Emily's email had not led to a discussion. It had not sparked a survey or a meeting or even a hallway conversation. It had disappeared quietly, and in its place came a lesson that didn't need to be spoken aloud. A few weeks later, someone mentioned, casually, almost as an afterthought, that a colleague from another team had been reassigned. No formal announcement. Just a quiet move framed as a better fit elsewhere. The reason was never officially stated. but people connected the dots. That colleague had complained once, not loudly, not emotionally, just enough to be remembered. After that, no one else followed. The cafeteria stayed the same. No one organized a protest. No one suggested a petition. There were no mass emails, no Slack channels dedicated to food quality, no collective action of any kind. There was no drama. Instead, people adapted. Lunchboxes began appearing more frequently in the office refrigerators. Brown bags lined up neatly on shelves, marked with names and dates. Some employees brought leftovers from home. Others packed simple meals, rice, salads, reheated pasta, food that traveled well and required no trust in a shared kitchen. Fast food bags became common sights by midweek. Burgers, burritos, fried chicken. Quick solutions to a predictable problem. Those who stayed in the building ate sandwiches, cold ones, wrapped in paper, eaten quickly at desks or in silence at small tables, eyes already drifting back to screens. The cafeteria still served meals, but fewer people relied on it. No one complained anymore. The conversations that once happened in line faded. What used to be a shared experience, standing shoulder to shoulder, commenting quietly, comparing plates, became fragmented. Everyone handled lunch on their own. Emily noticed how the topic disappeared from casual talk, not because the issue was resolved, but because it had been categorized as something that wasn't worth the cost of addressing. It wasn't that people didn't care. They cared differently now. They cared privately. They adjusted their routines. They made personal accommodations. They solved the problem individually, which made it invisible at a system level. That invisibility was powerful. From the company's perspective, the cafeteria was functioning. Fewer complaints meant fewer issues. Fewer issues meant success. Emily sat at her desk one afternoon, watching coworkers return from lunch. Some carried bags. Others carried nothing at all. A few looked energized, but most looked resigned. Work resumed. Meetings continued. Deadlines were met. The system worked. And yet, something essential was eroding. It wasn't just about food anymore. Emily realized that the real change had already happened, not in the cafeteria, but in people's expectations. They no longer expected comfort at work, or care, or responsiveness. They expected endurance. They expected to adjust themselves rather than the environment. That expectation settled in quietly, like dust. Emily thought back to her email and the response it had triggered. Not the words, but the consequences. How quickly the message had traveled through informal channels. How efficiently the signal had been received. Speak up, and nothing changes. Speak up and you might move sideways. Speak up and the system remembers. No one had said this directly. No one needed to. By the end of the month, the cafeteria had become background noise. People passed it without comment. The decline had stabilized, not because conditions improved, but because resistance had stopped. Emily felt something shift inside her. At first, she had believed the issue was the food, that if the quality improved, energy would return, morale would lift, and the small daily discomfort would disappear. Now she understood that the food was only the surface. The deeper issue was how easily the system redirected concern into silence. The company did not suppress feedback. It processed it, filtered it, reduced it to a manageable risk. And in doing so, it taught employees where the boundaries were. Most people respected those boundaries, not because they were weak, but because they were rational. Jobs were hard to find. Stability mattered. No one wanted to be remembered for raising an issue that didn't clearly belong to their role. Lunch was not core business. That phrase echoed quietly in Emily's mind. She began to see it everywhere. Small inconveniences dismissed as trade-offs. Gradual losses reframed as efficiencies. Comfort labeled as expendable, all justified by numbers that stayed within acceptable ranges. Emily understood now that if she continued pushing in the same way, emails, questions, formal channels, nothing would change. The system would continue to respond exactly as designed. She also understood something else. Silence wasn't forced. It was chosen. Chosen because it was easier, safer, less costly. The cafeteria had not become worse because no one cared. It had become worse because caring had been made impractical. And that realization marked a turning point for Emily. The problem was no longer the meals being served downstairs. It was the mechanism that made those meals untouchable, the way feedback dissolved before it reached anyone who could act, the way responsibility drifted sideways instead of upward. Emily stopped thinking about how to complain. She started thinking about how systems actually changed, not through noise, not through volume, but through moments when silence could no longer hold. And somewhere between the hum of the office and the quiet resignation of lunch hour, she understood that the next step would not look like resistance at all. It would look like something else entirely. Emily stopped sending emails, not because she had given up, but because she had learned what emails were for. They were not designed to change outcomes. They were designed to record intent, acknowledge concern, and then close the loop. Once an issue entered that system, it became something to be managed rather than addressed. It was categorized, filtered, and resolved on paper long before it reached anyone who could alter reality. Emily did not need another polite response. She needed to understand how decisions were actually made. So she began watching more carefully. Human resources, she realized, functioned as a buffer. It absorbed friction. It translated human discomfort into standardized language, then returned it in neutral terms. HR was not built to escalate problems upward. It was built to keep them from traveling too far. Facilities and operations were different. Ops existed to defend numbers, budgets, contracts, key performance indicators. Their success was measured by stability and cost control. If the cafeteria stayed open, the vendor met obligations, and expenses remained predictable. Ops had done its job. Quality, unless it violated a clause, was secondary. That left one place where the conversation could change direction: the executive level. Specifically, the CEO. Emily did not know David Lang personally. She had seen him on screens, at all-hands meetings, in carefully framed internal videos. He spoke often about culture, about values, about the importance of people. He used words like community and shared responsibility. He emphasized that the company succeeded because employees felt supported. But Emily noticed something else. David Lang never ate in the cafeteria. He spoke at events catered by outside vendors. He attended leadership lunches in private conference rooms. He appeared in photos holding coffee cups, not cafeteria trays. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was distance. The cafeteria existed several layers below his lived experience of the company. Emily understood then that no amount of explanation would bridge that gap. You could describe decline endlessly. You could attach charts and numbers, But as long as the issue remained abstract, it would stay invisible. Emily did not intend to make it abstract. She began preparing quietly. Not reports, not presentations, context. She pulled the vendor contract from the internal system, reading it carefully. It outlined minimum requirements, portion sizes, acceptable substitutions. Everything was technically compliant. Nothing was explicitly wrong. She compared costs over time. The numbers aligned with the announcement, same budget, updated vendor. The savings came from efficiency, not from reduced scope. On paper, Emily looked elsewhere. She tracked sick days across teams that relied heavily on cafeteria meals. The increase was modest, not enough to raise alarms, but consistent. She noted subtle turnover patterns, not resignations in waves, just small shifts. People leaving sooner than expected. Exit reasons that cited personal growth or new opportunities. She didn't draw conclusions. She just observed. Most importantly, she didn't share what she found. Emily understood that data alone wouldn't persuade anyone. In a system optimized for stability, data that stayed within acceptable ranges simply confirmed the status quo. What mattered wasn't proof. It was exposure. She started thinking less like an employee and more like the system itself. What triggered attention, what disrupted routine, what made decision makers pause? The answer wasn't outrage. It was embarrassment. Corporate systems tolerated discomfort easily. They tolerated inefficiency. They even tolerated quiet dissatisfaction. What they did not tolerate was visible contradiction, especially in front of outsiders. Emily knew the company prided itself on partnerships, international collaborations, executive visits. The optics of professionalism mattered deeply. Culture, in that context, was not a feeling. It was a performance, and performances required consistency. Emily waited. When news circulated that a delegation of international partners would be visiting, senior executives, high-profile collaborators, she paid attention. The visit would include joint meetings, strategy sessions, and formal meals. The partners, she learned, would not be eating in the company cafeteria. Different dietary standards, different expectations, a separate kitchen arrangement. That detail mattered. Emily did not see it as a setback. She saw it as an opening. She began doing something that looked unrelated to her job. She started learning to cook, not casually, methodically. She chose a dish that was widely recognized, technically demanding, but possible to learn without professional training. Something familiar enough that mistakes would be obvious to the right eyes. She practiced at home in the evenings. She followed recipes, watched videos, took notes, adjusted. But she imposed a constraint. She only used ingredients similar to those available in the company cafeteria. The same kind of chicken, the same quality of oil, pre-ground spices instead of fresh blends. She cooked within the system's limitations. The results were revealing. The dish was recognizable. It looked right. It smelled close enough. But something was missing. Depth, warmth, balance. Emily didn't fix it. She didn't upgrade ingredients or techniques. She left it exactly as it was. Because the point was not to impress. It was to demonstrate. She did not announce what she was doing. She didn't ask permission. She didn't frame it as feedback. When the day came, she brought the food to work. At lunch, she did not go to the cafeteria. She sat in a quiet hallway near the area reserved for the visiting delegation's kitchen. She ate slowly, deliberately, without making a show of it. She wasn't waiting for attention. She was waiting for the right eyes. Emily understood something now that she hadn't before. Change did not come from pushing harder. It came from stepping aside and letting reality collide with authority. She wasn't trying to convince anyone. She was setting the stage, and for the first time since the decline began, she felt calm because she was no longer asking the system to listen. She was preparing to let it see. The company prepared carefully for the arrival of its international partners. Conference rooms were booked weeks in advance. Presentation decks were reviewed and revised. Security protocols were tightened, schedules adjusted. Every detail that could be anticipated was handled with precision. Food, however, was treated differently. The visiting delegation from India came with its own arrangements, different dietary expectations, different standards. A temporary kitchen was set up on a separate floor, staffed by their own culinary team. It was efficient, respectful, and discreet. No one questioned it. The company cafeteria continued operating as usual, serving employees while the visitors ate elsewhere. Emily noticed the separation immediately. To most people, it confirmed what they already assumed. The cafeteria was not meant to impress. It was meant to function. Emily saw something else. She saw a comparison waiting to happen. In the days leading up to the visit, she cooked at home every evening. Not to perfect the dish, but to understand its limits. She chose chicken tikka masala deliberately. It was a dish known well enough that any deviation would be noticeable to someone who understood it. At the same time, it was common enough that attempting it did not feel presumptuous. It existed at the intersection of authenticity and accessibility. Emily followed recipes carefully. She watched demonstrations. She learned the theory behind the steps. Then she constrained herself. She used chicken breasts of the same quality the cafeteria purchased. She cooked with neutral vegetable oil instead of ghee. She relied on pre-ground spices, sealed months earlier, because that was what was available in bulk. She did not correct these limitations. She worked within them. The result was revealing. The dish looked right, the color was correct. The sauce had the expected thickness. To an untrained eye, it passed easily. But when Emily tasted it, she could tell what was missing. The flavors did not bloom. The richness felt thin. The warmth was muted. The dish resembled chicken tikka masala in structure, but not in spirit. It was familiar, but incomplete. That mattered. On the day of the delegation's arrival, Emily brought the food with her to work in a plain container. She did not announce it. She did not share it with coworkers. She did not frame it as anything other than lunch. When midday came, she did not join the cafeteria line. Instead, she walked to a quiet hallway near the area designated for the visiting team's kitchen. The space was neutral, transitional, neither private nor public. People passed through without lingering. Emily sat on a bench near the wall and opened her container. The smell rose slowly. It was not strong, not inviting in the way freshly cooked food sometimes was, but it carried something recognizable, enough to be noticed. Raj Malhotra, the executive chef for the delegation, was passing through the hallway when he slowed his steps. He did not stop because the scent was good. He stopped because it was almost right. Years of experience had trained him to recognize patterns instinctively. The foundation was there: the tomato base, the warmth of spice, the suggestion of cumin and coriander. But something was off. The aroma lacked depth. The fat did not carry the spices the way it should. The scent hovered instead of unfolding. Raj paused. He looked toward the bench and saw Emily eating quietly, focused on her meal. The food in her container matched the smell, familiar in appearance, subtly wrong in execution. He approached without urgency. His questions were simple, professional, not accusatory. When did she add the spices? What kind of fat did she use? Where did the ingredients come from? Emily answered honestly. She explained that she had learned from online sources, that she cooked at home, that she used what was available, that she was not trained. She did not apologize. She did not defend the dish. She explained the conditions. Raj listened. He did not taste the food immediately. He did not need to. The answers were enough. He understood what he was smelling. This was not a failure of skill. It was a limitation of inputs. The dish was constrained by quality long before technique could compensate. He recognized the pattern. Corporate catering, cost-controlled kitchens, ingredients selected for consistency, not excellence, cooking reduced to execution rather than craft. Raj had seen this before. He did not criticize. He nodded, offered a few neutral observations, and moved on. The interaction was brief. There was no agreement, no plan, no shared intent. But something important had happened. Raj now understood the environment Emily was working within, and Emily understood that she had been seen, not as a complainer, not as an employee pushing an agenda, but as someone navigating constraints with awareness. In the days that followed, their paths crossed occasionally. Small exchanges, technical comments, observations about ingredients and methods. Nothing that could be mistaken for collaboration. Just professional recognition. Emily did not push further. She did not need to. The seed had been planted. The contrast between the two kitchens, the temporary one built for visitors and the permanent one serving employees, existed now in a form that could not be abstracted away. It had a smell. It had a structure. It had context. Emily returned to her routines. She went to meetings. She worked through data sets. She ate lunch as usual, sometimes from home, sometimes from the cafeteria. But she was no longer watching for reactions. She was waiting for alignment. She knew now that the system would not change because someone asked it to. It would change when the right people experienced the discrepancy directly, without explanation, without framing, without preparation. The cafeteria had been designed to operate unnoticed. Emily had quietly ensured it would not remain that way forever. The formal lunch was meant to be effortless. It was scheduled at the midpoint of the visit, carefully positioned between strategy sessions and presentations. The setting was polished but understated. A private dining room reserved for executive meetings, designed to signal respect without excess. David Lang arrived on time. As CEO, he was accustomed to these moments. Cross-company lunches followed familiar patterns. Compliments were exchanged. Cultural gestures were acknowledged. Everything moved along an unspoken script. The food, prepared by the visiting delegation's culinary team, was exceptional. It was not extravagant, but it was intentional. Each dish was balanced, aromatic, and composed with quiet confidence. The flavors unfolded gradually, revealing depth without overwhelming the palate. David noticed. He appreciated good food, though he rarely thought about it at work. Meals were usually functional, squeezed between meetings, or delivered during brief pauses. This lunch was different. It demanded attention. Raj, seated among the delegation, spoke politely when the conversation turned to food. He mentioned in passing that the company had been welcoming, that the facilities were well run, that even the employee cafeteria reflected care. It was a courteous remark, nothing more. But David heard it differently. The comment landed at the intersection of pride and hospitality. In that moment, David felt an instinctive urge, not to clarify, not to deflect, but to demonstrate the company valued its people. That had always been the message. If the cafeteria had been mentioned, even casually, then it should stand alongside everything else being presented. Without hesitation, David responded. He suggested that food from the company cafeteria be brought up, not as a comparison, but as a gesture, a way of sharing the everyday experience of the organization. The decision was immediate and irreversible. There was a brief pause as the request traveled downward, through layers of staff. Coordinators exchanged looks. Assistants made calls. Someone hesitated, then proceeded. The cafeteria had not been informed. There was no plan for executive service, no dishes prepared for presentation, no time allocated for refinement. What existed was what was always served. Within minutes, trays arrived. The food was plated quickly, without ceremony. Portions were uneven. Garnishes were absent. The dishes were warm, but not fresh. Placed beside the delegation's meal, the contrast was immediate. Not dramatic, just undeniable. The colors were duller, the textures less considered, the aromas faint, almost apologetic. Nothing was technically wrong. Everything was edible, but nothing invited attention. David noticed the shift before anyone spoke. The room did not fall silent, but something changed. Conversations slowed. Movements became more careful. No one criticized the food. No one needed to. The difference spoke for itself. David tasted one dish, then another. He recognized the pattern instantly, not because the food was bad, but because it was familiar. This was the food he never ate. This was the experience he had authorized without ever sharing. Across the table, the delegation remained gracious. They ate politely. They did not compare. They did not comment. Raj said nothing. There was no accusation, no embarrassment imposed from the outside. The discomfort came from within. David felt it settle slowly, like weight. This was not a misunderstanding, not a logistical oversight, not a one-time lapse. This was a system operating exactly as designed. For the first time, David understood what acceptable range meant in practice. He understood how decline could exist without triggering alarms, how employees could endure something indefinitely as long as it never crossed a defined threshold. He thought about the language he used: culture, care, community. He had meant those words, but meaning, he realized, did not guarantee alignment. The meal ended without incident. There were no raised voices, no explanations offered. The trays were cleared quietly, as if nothing unusual had occurred. But David could not return to the conversation as before. He replayed the moment again and again. The automatic decision, the immediate exposure, the gap between intention and reality. He had not been deceived. He had been insulated. As the delegation departed later that afternoon, David thanked them sincerely. He maintained composure. He fulfilled every expectation of professionalism. But internally, something had shifted. The cafeteria was no longer an abstract operational unit. It was no longer a line item or a contract. It was a lived experience, one he had avoided without realizing it. That evening, after the building quieted and the day's momentum faded, David walked through the office alone. He passed desks, conference rooms, shared spaces. He stopped outside the cafeteria. The lights were still on. Staff moved, methodically preparing for the next day. Everything looked orderly, efficient. He stood there longer than necessary. For the first time, he did not see a support function. He saw a mirror, and in it the cost of distance. There was no public reckoning, no emergency town hall, no all-hands email filled with strong language, no visible display of anger or apology. The company moved the way it always did, quietly, deliberately, behind closed doors. The difference was not in how loudly leadership reacted, but in how quickly the machinery began to turn. Within days of the executive lunch, David Lang requested a full audit of the cafeteria vendor. The request did not come through human resources. It did not pass through facilities or operations first. It went directly to procurement and legal. The scope was broad: ingredient sourcing, cost structures, compliance with contract language, substitution practices, margins. Everything that had once been summarized in tidy reports was examined in detail. At the same time, a temporary oversight group was formed. Not a task force with branding or internal messaging, just a small cross-functional team with authority to observe, question, and report without routing findings through the usual filters. The cafeteria staff noticed first. Supervisors asked unfamiliar questions. Deliveries were inspected more closely. Inventory was logged with greater precision. Long-standing assumptions were revisited. The vendor noticed next. Meetings were requested. Explanations offered. Justifications prepared. Everything was framed as alignment with industry standards and cost efficiency. But the language no longer landed the way it used to. The audit did not look for violations alone. It looked for patterns, for intent, for the cumulative effect of decisions that were individually defensible but collectively corrosive. The findings were clear. Nothing illegal had happened in isolation. Nothing catastrophic had occurred at once. But the system had been engineered to drift downward, slowly, predictably, while remaining technically compliant. That drift had consequences. Within weeks, the vendor contract was terminated. No announcement accompanied the decision. No blame was assigned publicly. The change was communicated as a routine transition. Behind the scenes, it was not routine. Several internal stakeholders were dismissed quietly, their roles eliminated, their access revoked. In a few cases, files were transferred to legal for further review. No names were shared. No statements were issued. The company did not frame the changes as a response to failure. It framed them as course correction. The cafeteria began to change, not overnight, but steadily. Ingredients improved. Portions became consistent. The food gained weight, warmth, presence. Meals no longer looked assembled. They looked prepared. Employees noticed. Not immediately, not all at once. But gradually, the brown bags disappeared. Fast food bags became less common. People returned to the cafeteria out of curiosity at first, then habit. Lunch became communal again. Conversations returned to the lines. People sat together without rushing. The afternoon energy shifted, subtly, but unmistakably. No one made speeches about it. The company did not ask for praise. It simply allowed the improvement to exist. Emily observed all of this from her usual distance. She was not called into meetings. She was not thanked. She was not acknowledged in any formal way. Her performance reviews remained unchanged. Her name did not appear in internal communications. No one referenced her email, her observations, or her quiet persistence. That was intentional. The company had chosen not to create a hero. It had chosen to correct a system. Emily understood the decision immediately. Recognition would have simplified the story. It would have narrowed responsibility. It would have suggested that the problem existed because one person noticed. That was not the truth. The truth was that many people had noticed. They just hadn't been in a position to be seen. On a quiet afternoon, several weeks later, Emily took her lunch to a small table near the windows. The cafeteria was calm, not busy, not empty, balanced. Raj was there that day, cooking for a smaller follow-up visit. No delegation, no executives. Just a brief stop as partnerships continued. He had prepared chicken tikka masala. This time it was done properly. The aroma was rich and layered. The spices bloomed fully. The sauce carried warmth and depth. The dish was familiar and complete. Emily ate slowly. She did not look around to see who noticed. She did not wait for a reaction. She smiled once to herself, not out of triumph, out of quiet satisfaction. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded attention. She had not tried to dismantle the system from the outside. She had simply arranged circumstances so that the truth could not be avoided. The changes that followed did not need her name attached to them. They were larger than that. As Emily finished her meal and returned to her desk, the company continued on its adjusted path. Work resumed. Meetings filled calendars. New issues emerged, as they always did. But something fundamental had shifted. The cafeteria was no longer invisible, and neither was the cost of ignoring everyday experiences. Some changes, Emily knew, did not require outrage. They did not require slogans or campaigns. They required proximity. They required the people with power to encounter reality without insulation, to taste it, to sit with it, to recognize themselves in it. Only then did systems begin to move, and when they did, they moved quietly but decisively.